Hi class, for today's video we're going to be looking at China's commercial revolution and figuring out what's happening at China at this point. So the last time we discussed China we were looking at the Tang Dynasty. We looked at some of the innovations that they put in place as far as the government and also the way that women were viewed and subjects like that. So to begin looking at the Song Dynasty, it's important to understand what it rises out of. After the Tang Dynasty, you have a period somewhat similar to the Warring States period, where you have many different groups that are vying for power. There becomes this time period that's known as the Five Dynasty period, where there was a 53-year long period where China was ruled by different regional governments, of which 5 were the most important. The Song Dynasty was finally found around 1960. They keep in place many of the political structures with the emperor at the top of a central bureaucracy that the Tang had had. On top of this bureaucracy, they are going to oversee local governments. However, the Song Dynasty wants to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes as the Tang Dynasty or the dynasties that came before. Several times in Chinese history so far, we've seen that within a dynasty, you'll have a regional governor who becomes very powerful. Oftentimes these men were generals. They had led armies against the northern peoples or the western peoples that they were fighting against, and because of that they have the loyalty of these troops. In having this loyalty, they can force their troops or even just ask their troops simply to rise up against the government and will probably be successful. So in order to avoid this, in 976, the emperor summoned his most important generals and explained that one reason why the Tang failed was because of regional governors, again, many of them former generals, who were too powerful. So they had to retire. In forcing these generals to retire, he set a precedent and really changed the structure of politics. More power would now be in the hands of bureaucrats rather than generals. Those in the capital held the highest positions. They had the same ministries as the Tang Dynasty, so the Ministry of Revenue, Civil Appointments, Rights, Works, Punishments, and War. However, they also broke the kingdom into 220 different districts or prefecturaries that were broken down into sub-districts, and they were headed by a magistrate. The role of this magistrate was to obtain tax money, and in obtaining this tax money, he is able to send that to the federal government. You also see that the magistrates are in charge of implementing justice, and they were grouped sort of these smaller regions into 20 larger units called circuits. Dynasties in China always seem to have issues with nomadic peoples, especially those coming in from the north. For the Song Dynasty, their troubles began with the Khitan in modern-day Mongolia. The Khitan were a very powerful group of people, but not powerful enough in themselves to take on the Song Dynasty. They allied themselves with the Jurchen. The Jurchen were a forest-dwelling peoples. They were very skilled horsemen, and they were from Manchuria. The Jurchen were more powerful than the Khitan, and in combining their forces, they would have been able to combine their fleets in order to defeat the Song. However, in 1155, the Jurchen, rather than taking on the Song, actually broke free from the Khitan and formed their own dynasty, the Jin Dynasty. Eventually, the Song and Jurchen ended up working together in order to defeat the Khitan. They did this in 1125. So in this moment, you see that the Khitan, the people who had once been their allies, the Jurchen, end up actually working with the Song Dynasty to defeat them. However, the Jurchen were also a powerful peoples, and once they had defeated their mutual enemy, they turned and attacked the Song Dynasty. The Jurchen had a powerful cavalry, but this wouldn't be enough. On both sides, you see that people began to rely on gunpowder as weapons as well. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the Silk Road, and in looking at the Silk Road, we saw that there were many goods that were coming from China. Goods that were obvious like silk and porcelain, but we also discussed the fact that gunpowder was also a good that was invented in China and would later spread to the rest of the world. At this point, gunpowder was used for weapons. However, it was used a little bit differently than what we might think of today. To use gunpowder, they used it in both complex and simple ways. First, you had basic ways that it was used. So an archer would tie small bags of the powder onto arrows, which would then detonate on impact. In more complex ways, the Chinese also began to create flamethrowers. The Chinese are also able to create siege towers. These towers are larger than the city's walls, and they would be used to shoot incendiary bombs. The Chinese, or the Song Dynasty, eventually falls to the Jurchen in around 1127. Citizens in the city of Kafing in January of 1127 surrendered. This shows that these northern peoples are very, very smart. It also proves that they are going to be very easily able to sort of take control of the Chinese. This meant once they lost the city of Kafing, and here is a map for you as well so that you can see this northern city up here, this northern Song area. Once this was basically surrendered, that means that there's an end to the northern Song dynasty. When we looked at Rome, we saw that Rome eventually was split into an eastern and a western side. And while western Rome arguably fell into ruins in the centuries after that divide, the Eastern dynasty was still able to flourish. You see something somewhat similar happening to the Chinese under the Song dynasty. So the map that I've added up here for you shows again that with the northern Song, their capital is up here at Kafing. Once this city is taken, many people are going to begin migrating further to the south. In doing so, they began the Southern Song Dynasty, and it's split into the Northern and the Southern Song. The emperor of the Song Dynasty and his son, Huozong, were captured. Huozong was a very great artist. I have some of his art up here for you to view. But even though they were captured, eventually one of Huozong's 10 sons is able to escape, and he is going to be named emperor in the latter part of 1127. The capital is going to be moved south of the Yangtze River, and you'll see that the Southern Song will begin in 1127 and will run until around 1279. And we'll talk about why it falls in a little while. But with this, not only do you see that the emperor and the capital are moving further south, but many people will also be forced to move further south. So again, here's another map to show you the Song Dynasty and how China at this point is moving much further south. Now, as people move to the south, life is much more difficult for those in the south than those in the north, at least for those who move. In the south, people were very capable of living in this region. They understood what they should and should not do. They understood how to grow rice. They understood the issues with mosquitoes and malaria, and they were able to survive through this. In the north, people had grown millet and wheat, and most of the time they would take that millet and wheat and they would turn it into noodles. In the south, people grew rice, so there was a change in diet. We'll talk in a minute, though, about how that might actually be a positive change. In addition, between the north and the south, there were many cultural differences, so much so that their languages were incomprehensible. Think about it this way. There are many groups throughout the world who speak English, but sometimes if you speak to someone who has a much different dialect than you, it can be harder to understand them. But just think about that on a much more magnified scale, because it said that a lot of times these people couldn't even understand each other. It was completely incomprehensible. In addition to that, the South was not ready for this influx. The city of Haozhong, right here that I have up here, or Hangzhou, it was a small city, and while it was probably the biggest in the south, a lot of that having to do with its proximity to the north as well as to the coast, it was not ready to take in more than the 5,000 people who came just as part of this initial fleeing and the fleeing of the bureaucracy. The woman that I have pictured up here, this is Li Shiwangzhao, and she actually becomes a really great artist. At this time, I think it's easy for us to just look at it and say that people moved further south, but for a lot of people, this meant moving their homes. Imagine today if there was to be some sort of invasion and people are attacking in the place that you live, and you end up having to flee to a completely new part of the world where people have a very different cultural understanding than you. It's hard for you to understand them. Their diet is completely different. And on top of that, a lot of people lose family members in the fighting. So a lot of young men lose their lives. A lot of people lose loved ones when they initially move to the South to diseases and issues like malaria. So this is a very, very hard time. And Li Xingzhao is actually going to write a memoir about the migration. She then goes on to write a lot of very beautiful poems about what she experiences. So she and her husband actually fled in 1127 after the capital city had been taken to avoid the invading troops. When they left, as with many immigrants fleeing to other parts of countries or to other parts of the world, they had to leave most of their belongings behind. There was simply no way for them to effectively flee while bringing with them all of their clothes, their pots, their pans, everything that they had. In addition to this, she and her husband were relatively well off and were very involved in the art community. Because of this, their home was filled with many different priceless pieces of artwork. They had a 10-room home, so in this you can see they are relatively well off, considering that most Chinese live in 1 or 2-room buildings at this point. Once they fled, their house was eventually burnt down. Those artworks, their clothing, their lives that they had built would never be able to be resurfaced. In addition to losing her home and her possessions, Li Xingzhao also lost her husband, which was arguably the biggest impact on her life. She and her husband had been very close, and as we'll talk about in just a second, a lot of her poetry reflects the relationship that the two of them had. Her husband died due to malaria as they moved to the South, and she wrote poetry mourning and talking about this experience. While it's often the fact in history that the common person isn't able to write down their experience, it can also be the case that a common person will be able to be reflected through poetry, through these memoirs. And we can see here that a woman lost everything. She might have had more than most, but she still lost everything, including a loved one, and still went on to write this beautiful poetry about it. Eventually, after 14 more years of fighting between the Jin and the Song Dynasty, you see that the Song Dynasty and the Jurchen are going to sign a peace treaty in 1142. The origins of the commercial revolution that I talked about at the beginning of this video go back very far. Before, many viewed southern China as a remote backwater region that was a breeding ground for malaria. When northerners came to the south, they immediately went to the highlands and they began draining the swamps. There's a very tricky way when it comes to growing rice, so I'm going to read you a little excerpt about how rice is grown. They use pumps to regulate the flow of water into walled fields of rice. After planting rice seeds in small gardens, they transplanted the rice seeds into a field drained of water. Once the plants had taken root, they flooded the fields with water until the crop ripened. People in the South also experimented with rice and found that rice that was grown in Vietnam had a shorter growing season. If they could plant 2 harvests per year, they could get more food. So in this, that sort of explains to you a little bit about how people grow rice, but they really, you have to understand these people are shifting completely to the South. And because of this, rice is going to become a staple in their diet as opposed to noodles. And in this shift, you see that people really start to figure out how they can support this large of a population. And one way that they do that is by growing this Vietnamese rice, which has a shorter growing season. If they can grow that, they can get 2 harvests per year, which is going to increase the amount of food and the amount of calories that can be distributed among the people. With this, the shift to rice actually leads to many population changes. So first of all, we've already talked a little bit about this, but you see more people moving from the north to the south. In the year 742, 60% of the Chinese population of around 60 million people lived in the north. So most of them lived in the north. By the time you get to 980, 62% are going to be living in the south. So you can see this sort of shift of people from the north to the south. More food also led to an increase in the population more generally. So you're going to see that there are around 100 million people as opposed to the 60 million in 742 by the time you get to the year 1000. So that's a pretty significant jump, around 40 more million people over the course of a little over 250 years. So you can see that rice also increases the population. With rice, with there being more calories per person, you can also see that people are more able to focus on arts and crafts. You see a trend of more people living in the South, that continues today, and more people being involved in arts and crafts means that there's more for historians to understand and analyze. So this is kind of similar to what we saw at the beginning of class, where we talked about the fact that as people become these more agricultural societies, there's no longer a need for every single person in a hunting-gathering society to be dedicated to the production of food. With the commercial revolution, as you see increases in calories yet again, you see that even more people are going to be able to move away and shift away from working in agriculture or working in producing food. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in just a second. So with the Song Dynasty, you see that more people are producing for market, so they need a way to pay for their purchases. Whether it's a farmer who wants to buy some new tools, whether it's a potter who needs to buy some more food, whatever it might be, they need a way to pay for their purchases. Under the Tang Dynasty, there had been this implementation of creating a unified coinage system, and this coinage system worked well. The Song Dynasty also used this coinage system. In fact, they minted 20 times more coins than the Tang Dynasty had. Li Xingzhao described her husband's trips to the market. She described the busyness of the streets, and she described loving when they were able to get their hands on things like oranges and tangerines from southern China that were now available throughout the dynasty. In the north, the middle region, the south, everybody was able to get their hands on oranges. Much like today, we're able to get food from different parts of the world, different parts of the United States, and oftentimes you can get it at any time of the year just by going to a local supermarket. So this is definitely going to change people's lives. However, it's important to note that with metal currency, with coinage, they're very heavy most of the time. Their currency would have looked like a bronze coin with a little square at the top, and you would have been able to tie them to a string. Now, around the year 1000, it was seen and sort of understood how this could be kind of tricky to carry around. A string of 1,000 coins weighed around 8 pounds. So imagine carrying 2 or 3 of those with you when you went into market. You're carrying, 16, 24 pounds with you just so that you can carry your money. Imagine if your wallet was that heavy. So eventually they start to switch to paper. And remember last time we looked at China and the Silk Road, we looked at paper and we looked at how it was produced first in China. So as they start to produce paper, they are able to use it again as a paper currency. And I have an example of paper Chinese currency on the screen for you to view as well. This furthers the commercial revolution. However, as with any society that switches from coinage to paper money, they have to question how much paper money they should create. If you create too much, then you will have inflation. If you create too little, then you will have a recession. So there were many issues that had to be taken into account. Some wanted to use more caution, others wanted to be more free with the printing of this money. When you get to the year around 1069, the emperor of the Song Dynasty actually appointed a new ground counselor. This ground counselor was more radical, and he instituted many new policies. For example, he wanted to pay all government salaries in paper money. In doing so, government officials would be able to further stimulate the economy, And this would help to lead to more artisans, to more people who had different types of jobs. In addition to that, he also wanted to extend low-interest loans to peasants. The main idea here is that by giving peasants these loans, there would be a chance that they could come and work in the city as opposed to working in the countryside. If they're able to work in the city, that means that you can have more people working in the production of different types of goods. So for example, in just a second, we're going to talk about cast iron, wrought iron, and steel. In these productions, we'll see that there are many people who have to come from the countryside to come and work in these like proto-factories almost. So it's really important to understand the importance of giving peasants enough money that they could move to the cities. However, the issue that ends up taking place is that peasants weren't able to pay this money back, and by the time you get to around 1086, the reforms had failed. And you see that for the Chinese, these types of reforms would not be instituted until a much, much later date. So, going back to cast iron and wrought iron, the commercial revolution led to the increased production of all goods, not just foods like rice and fruit. Iron production boomed. Entrepreneurs began building large-scale workshops to produce iron products in factory-like spaces with hundreds of workers. Like I said, these are not the factories that we would think of today. They're not using any sort of power or anything like that, like we would think of with a traditional factory today, but you still have the labor of hundreds of people under one roof. And the goal with this is to produce a surplus of these different goods. Song metal workers worked two main kinds of iron, cast and wrought. Cast iron was poured into a mold and was hard. It could not be worked with a hammer. Once it was poured, that's all you have. Think about like a cast iron pan today. Even if you take some sort of a hammer and try to beat up against that, it's not going to change its shape. Now, wrought iron is a little bit different. Wrought iron is more malleable, and it's malleable enough that blacksmiths could work it. And the demand for both types of iron was considerable. First, soldiers needed iron armor and weapons, and the government also needed nails and locks for building bridges. Even though things were signed in a peace treaty with the Jurchen, that does not mean that the Chinese are completely out of the woods when it comes to northern invaders, and the military needs more and more iron for defense, for creating weapons, for creating armor. In addition to that, with this commercial revolution, as you see more buildings being built, as you see more factory-like spaces being built, you see that people have to have more iron, and they have to eventually have more steel as well in order to do this. So it's this sort of cycle of building these factory-like spaces and then, reinvesting into that sort of iron industry that has created itself in China at this point. In addition to that, the Chinese also learned how to produce steel. Now, steel is one of the strongest metals that is known, and you can use steel to make steel swords. By 1078, China was producing 125,000 tons of iron, or 1.3 pounds per person per year. Europe would only come close to this many, many years later in the Industrial Revolution. Going back to Li Xingzhao and her husband, her writings also tell us a lot about the Chinese in general. So her husband treated her as an intellectual equal, and it seemed that she was a very, very smart woman. This is rare for any society, but in medieval China, during this commercial revolution, she was treated as an intellectual equal to her husband. In addition to that, urban prosperity had led to leisure pursuits, and people like Li Xingzhao and her husband would have likely gone to restaurants. For example, Kaifeng had around 72 restaurants, and many of these would later be moved to the south. Within these restaurants, many of them were 3 floors high, and they were sometimes licensed and created by the government. In these restaurants, people often specialized in certain types of foods, and even the working class would be able to eat at the restaurants. Eating at these restaurants would have been something that most were able to do. Even if they couldn't eat at the restaurants, there would be local street stands where people would be able to purchase food as well. However, many cities, as they grow larger, they create these issues of sanitation. And this is absolutely the case in China as well. As the city gets bigger, sanitation decreases. And as sanitation decreases, you can see that for many people, disease spreads and conditions continue to get a little bit worse. In addition to having more restaurants, more factory-like buildings, more shops for people to go to, more people working in art, the commercial revolution also brought an information revolution that would parallel today's internet boom. Caused in part by woodblock printing, this revolution would go on to spread to other parts of the world. In 1040, a Chinese bookmaker named Bi Xing invented a movable type where each character was made separately and arranged on a frame to form a page. Before 700, creating a book was very slow and laborious. This process was laborious because all script had to be copied by hand. Now, many more people would be able to afford books and they would be able to learn to read. People had more disposable income, so they could also finance the education of their children. This intensified the competition for things like government jobs. More families were able to hire scholars who had failed the civil service exams to serve as tutors for their sons and daughters. Some women also began to enjoy increased educational opportunities. At the same time that foot binding began to spread, more women were beginning to get an education. Although they could not take the civil service exams, many women learned to read and write and to take care of their family's finances. We know a great deal about women at this time because they wrote biographies. Many also wrote epitaphs and had them placed in their tombs. They revealed what kind of a woman was admired. While the Song Dynasty had emphasized physical appearance and ancestor, the Song had praised women for successfully managing their homes, finances, and for skills in math. Praise was also found for women for tutoring their children at home and for making economies that allowed their offspring to attend school when they were older. Women also could choose whether or not they married or remarried. So in this, we can see that the status of women is something that is very interesting to try and understand. So more women are going to be educated. However, they still cannot apply for jobs in the government, even if they wanted to. They're not going to be allowed to take these civil service exams. However, we can also see that this is the same, again, time that foot binding is coming around and women are used more in the homes. So while they do make some nominal gains, there are still many ways the lives of women will be improved later on. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, learned a little bit about the commercial revolution and the Song Dynasty. Again, just a couple of main points to pull up. The Song Dynasty will eventually shift to the south. With this commercial revolution, you see a growth in the population, so more people are able to do something other than working in food production. A shift to paper currency. Within towns, you also start to see more artwork that will become popular, more crafts. You also see that there are these proto-factories that are producing things like cast iron, wrought iron, and steel. You also see that restaurants become very popular, but of course, with the increase of cities, sanitation also weakens. And finally, we also talked about the importance of woodblock printing and changes in education for women. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.